Hi, today in this presentation we're going to be discussing a rather difficult topic. Here in Israel recently there was an extremely high profile case where a beloved child's author, uh, therapist, and advocate for child safety ended up being revealed that for over 22 years, if not more, had a history of sexual abuse of pubescent minors, prepubescent minors, and even adults. For such a beloved individual to be revealed is so vile. Many people's maps of meaning are shattering. How could it be that such a human being did what he did, given everything he was doing? What is a pedophile, child molester? How can we protect ourselves from such individuals? Better understand their psychology, better understand the profile, and respond accordingly. On top of which, how do we deal with the cultural factors that exist within a religious community? This individual was ostensibly a member of the ultra-Orthodox community, Haredi society. And in this presentation, we're going to have to tackle cultural factors. How does a clinician interact in such a community, on the one hand being sensitive and aware of what this community values and the way it organizes itself, and on the other hand, being able to be of service not just to that community, but to those who are abused, the victims as well. And oftentimes, therapists, social workers do run into conflict in this particular demographic, not always. And so in this presentation, I'm going to outline Jewish law regarding this issue and give practical resources that clinicians can turn to in order to create an allyship in this community and do what needs to be done to protect people. So to better understand sexual abusers, we have to root ourselves in, well, what is quote-unquote normal human sexuality? And that is a tall order and worthy of another presentation that will be given another time. So suffice it to say, however, on one foot, for such a complicated issue, human sexuality is governed by genetic, cultural, and individual factors. Sexual arousal in general, partners that are picked for intimacy, for short-term and long-term relationships, well, there are going to be generalities that are common amongst both men and women, but men and women are different in their sexuality. Men, a good metaphor for who they're looking for in a partner, I would call a nurturing nymph. There's this paradox between someone who is compassionate, caring, stable, reliable, nurturing, with this nymph aspect, the wild, out of control, in a good way, this wild, out of control sexual being. For men, primarily the door to open up sexuality is through physical markers, whereas for women, the story is much different and much more complicated. I mean, number one, it kind of has to be because as far as a woman's concerned, there are very big reasons to be very cautious of who they pick as partners. Humans are not, within the research, we're not defined as tournament species. We are a binding species. We are living creatures that do mate for life. Sure, we have some free will we can throw in there. There is a lot of variation, but definitively monogamous relationships are the rule cross-culturally. And fair enough, there are cultures that do practice non-monogamous relationships, but those relationships are, in fact, becoming fewer and far between. Within the entire world population, monogamous relationships are becoming not only the primary type of relationship, but the only type of relationship that people do connect into. So women are much more complicated. One way of looking at the female sexual desire for who they're looking for a partner is the tender protector, someone who you might even think of as the archetypal beast in Beauty and the Beast. Someone who's tough, rough, he can stand his ground, but a person who is tender, caring, he'll be there. You can bet this guy is going to be the one who'll be willing to walk the kid back to sleep at 2 a.m. There's several doors that have to be opened up here to open up female sexuality. The women generally, in terms of who they seek for partners, social status matters. Women will engage in relationships in hierarchies where they're trying to at least find someone who's on the same level of human hierarchy or above. And that's a complicated issue, how you can conceptualize hierarchies within human relationships. There might be one other species, if memory serves, a type of African beetle. But aside from that, humans have a unique characteristic of having dual hierarchies for both genders, for both biological sexes, for both men and women. So hierarchy is very complicated, and again, that's worthy of another presentation. But as a general rule, women are attracted to people who are competent. Safety is a second issue that, again, a woman's concern. It's much more dear to her heart for obvious reasons, childcare, and so that her securing safety, finding somebody who can provide that safety and to ensure that their children, will be okay in the long run is another door that has to pass through. That one has to pass through in order to open up feelings of intimacy for women. And finally, just like men, women do have there are physical markers that are attractive to women, and these are common sense markers for both genders, and don't have to explicitly spell that one out. You guys know what they are. There is variation, getting back to this idea of cultural influences of physical features that are not universal. While, for example, for women, height is a universal characteristic that women do find attractive. Things like eyes, feet, hands. People have their preferences. Some people like longer noses. Some people don't. I mean, these are very unique, but they're not universal characteristics. But something to bear in mind, when going down in this area of research. The challenge for both men and women, in these two ways of conceptualizing who they're looking for in a partner, the nurturing nymph and the tender protector, is that these things are somewhat at odds. They are a bit of a paradox here in terms of personality profile. That's one issue at play that often makes relationships more difficult to understand and be in. Number two, talking about human sexuality is a huge taboo, and there's a lot of really good reasons for that. Cultures across the entire planet have created what cynics would call taboos, but probably better conceptualized as cultural rules that protect human sexuality, a way of being able to take responsibility for such a complicated thing as human sexuality, and that these rules become implicit in human behavior. They may very well not be something which people are consciously aware of, but certainly are an important factor in protecting the dyad and to be able to encourage the continuation of the species on different levels. Suffice it to say, maintaining a long-term relationship is difficult. Some research indicates the vast majority of people are simply not satisfied in their long-term relationships. However, keep banging away at trying to make that relationship better, because there are fundamental qualities within the love relationship that are not just fulfills physical survival needs, but brass tacks, just like human beings need water and food, we also need love. And that there is huge research literature indicating that when love, closeness, caring are not in an individual's life, it shatters them. Quite often even leads to death. Again, a complicated issue, best left for another presentation, but important to touch on this issue to have a foil when looking at pedophilia and child molestation. Now, for the vast majority of human history, it's no surprise that children do get abused. But what has been surprising is at what rate children are actually at risk and harmed. It wasn't until the 1960s within the United States that child protection laws were put in place. Since that time and onwards, the reporting of abuse has skyrocketed, and the understanding of what child abuse in general and sexual abuse specifically does to a child has only become common knowledge within the research community from the 1980s and onwards. So, in a certain respect, we within the field have been caught flat-footed in understanding what exactly the problems are, what results from abuse, and that has taken time for different communities around the world to process. And it's worth noting this because when dealing with a community like the ultra-Orthodox community, for valid reasons, there is a emphasis on isolationism, but that isolationism does come with a cost. And one cost has been a lag time in understanding and taking seriously and believing to begin with just how detrimental child abuse and sexual abuse actually are. And when we discuss the Jewish legal ramifications of this issue, this is going to be a central topic in understanding, well, why is it some rabbinic authorities don't place as much emphasis as they ought to on protecting children, and why others, without question, are definitely putting children first. Now, as far as pedophilic abuse goes, it's often not reported for a number of different reasons. Quite often, in half the cases, research has discovered that children themselves are not reporting it because they feel that they can handle the abuse or it didn't bother them, that they didn't have the psychological maturity to understand what was going on. Another reason is fear of reaction from the abuser, that they will be harmed physically or their family will be harmed in some way, that this individual who's an abuser becomes larger than life and becomes a force of nature to be feared. Consistently, children themselves often take responsibility for what happened to them. They see that they look at themselves as being the ones who might have instigated it, even though this is absolutely not true. And they don't want to get the abuser in trouble for their mistakes. And this is a common psychological problem that people quite often will, in order to make sense of the world, place themselves in the middle as the primary cause of what goes on in their world. And we know this is absolutely not true, but serves as a stabilizing skill that people do draw from in order to make sense of their lives, even though, especially in this case, children are not at fault for what's going on and what has happened to them. There's another problem in terms of just basically understanding pedophilia, is that we have a very dramatic research sampling bias. The vast majority of research that has been done on pedophiles has been within a prison population, and the question we have here is, well, those who never ended up in prison are going to be quite different than people who do end up in prison. Some people are never caught. There's low level offenses that simply do not go to court or are written off by either the child or the parents themselves. There are predators who probably do have a better impulse control and are able to plan out their abuse more methodically, and this seems to be the case here with Chaim Walder here in Israel, the high-profile case I was talking about earlier. And there are probably those who are better able to navigate the legal system, have more money, have more resources, have more connections to draw from, and so within the research, these folks who undoubtedly exist simply have not been assessed at any level. And on top of that, we have a question of, well, those that we are assessing within the prison population, well, are they being honest? the explanations that they give of the reason why they abused might often put them in a better light than what is actually true, and so it's hard to sift through the facts from the fantasies on this one. On top of this, there's a small sample population, and more fundamentally, across research, we have a confusion of terms. Terms are not consistently used in the same way. Definitions are different in as far as what is being described, the acts that are being described, the individuals that are being assessed, and so there is huge inconsistencies in the research in general that we have to sift through. So I offer this as a warning as I push forward here in my analysis of what a child abusers look like. That it's a tentative explanation. And as we push forward here into explaining the specific case of Chaim Walder, we're going to see a lot of similarities in his case and the research, and some significant differences that need to be outlined. So a brief overview of terms. Number one, within the literature, the forced sexual offenses are defined as sexual acts done against another person's will. You can kind of look at this as an umbrella term that all these other terms are going to fall into. The next is pedophilia, which we're going to be placing most of our emphasis on here in this presentation, where it's arousal that is generated from prepubescent children. Now, comparatively to child molesters in general, pedophiles are 10 times more likely to act against children than non-pedophilic child molesters. Within pedophilia, there are different categories of pedophiles: heterosexual pedophiles, homosexual pedophiles, and bisexual pedophiles. The heterosexual pedophiles generally have lower rates of abuse, on average abusing about 20 children in their lifetime, whereas homosexual pedophiles, around 150 children are abused in their lifetime. And this would be the case for bisexual pedophiles as well. The question of abuse, what constitutes abuse, is worth describing, and there's different levels of severity. Voyeurism, exhibitionism, frauderism, that's an interesting category, which oftentimes is overlooked as nurturing qualities, where, say, bouncing a child on your lap, or someone rubbing up against another person in public. These things are covert actions where the individual has some level of plausible deniability that it was innocent. And finally, sadism or violent acts, which are much more direct, which would very much be the case here in our case example of Chaim Walder, who time and time again was quite viciously violated different individuals, betraying their trust. Another category, hebephilia and ebophilia. These are different than pedophilia, where the sexual interest is not for prepubescent children, but children, teenagers who are hovering around the Tanner stages 2 and 3 of sexual development. So we're looking at kids who are 13 to 16 years old. What we're going to see in this case, and that is common in the question of pedophilia, is that while we have these taxonomies, nothing is set in stone, and a fair amount of pedophiles will jump around from older teens, younger kids, and adults. And those particular child offenders are the most dangerous and do cause the most damage. This particular category of those that are offending against only kids who are in Tanner 2 and Tanner 3 stages of development, they're more often looking for reciprocal relationships. They are more opportunistic, grabbing chances that make themselves available as opposed to being more planned out. They do have better social functioning in general in their broader interactions with people, and they do have better treatment outcomes. and we're going to hit that later, that the treatment outcomes for sexual offenders is quite low. Child molesters are another category of people who sexually touch another child, and here it's a little more technical in the definition, where the offender is 4 years older than their victim. Part of this is to eliminate normal childhood experimentation. Children do quite often play doctor, and this is a reason why parents, especially within the Jewish community, a lot of parents do take their Shabbos nap. This is one reason to stop taking your Shabbos nap and just get a good night's sleep. One of the best ways of avoiding these issues is parental observation. The vast majority of offenders are going to be friends, they're going to be family, they're going to be other siblings. These are people you know. It is going to be exceedingly rare that sexual offenders are random strangers you have never heard of or seen of. So being present, being around is your best defense against this issue. This category is also used to technically exclude children from being pedophiles themselves. Now, 40% of assaults against children younger than 12 that are committed by juveniles, they're going to be the most frequent of offenders. 88% of child molesters in the future will eventually go on to meet criteria for pedophilia. And these folks here are going to be the most likely to exhibit psychopathic traits. Now, before pushing ahead in the subject, we have to clarify what are the different levels of sexual abuse that researchers are trying to describe in the work that they're doing. Unwanted sexual activity is one of the more general ways of conceptualizing sexual abuse, encompassing things from inappropriate ways of speaking, touch, to actual sexual assault. So the broadest term that you can look at. Now, people for their 20s, women, different research reports different figures, ranging from 74% of women to 94% of women will report this basic definition of unwanted sexual activity. What's noteworthy is that men have the same rates of report, that men also report between 70 and 98% saying that they themselves have also been the victims of unwanted sexual activity. Unwanted sexual intercourse narrows the field a lot. In general, the population breakdown is 40% to 50% of women are reporting unwanted intercourse. Now, this is not rape necessarily. This category includes after the fact regret. So that's why these figures are going to be much higher. So women are going to be hovering around 50% of the time, are going to have some level of regret and not wanting to have engaged in sexual activity, whereas we see similar figures, 43% to 63% of men will also be reporting this same figure. And like I said, it's not just after the fact regret. There may be social pressures involved. These include people who are in long-term relationships and they feel that their partner is not respecting their own boundaries. So again, this is a broad category, not necessarily including actual sexual molesters, abusers, and pedophiles. Getting more specific in terms of unwanted sexual contact, before age 18, we're seeing 31% of women are being abused during this up to this point, and 16% of men have experienced this. And the reason for this is there are biological factors involved in why people are targeted in the first place. Women who are older teenagers and in their early 20s have astronomically higher likelihoods of being sexually abused compared to other age groups of women. So there's a sort of target age there that one has to be especially vigilant in regards to this issue. Whereas you're not seeing that necessarily with men themselves. When we get to repeated unwanted sexual contact before age 18, here things get a lot more complicated. We're seeing 21% of women reporting this repeated unwanted sexual contact, and mostly it's going to be with other children. So this is younger age girls are going to be seeing that repetitive repetitive abuse, whereas 44% of men are going to be suffering before the age of 18 repeated unwanted sexual contact. And again, there's a variety of reasons in terms of who the abusers are. That this is going to represent homosexual pedophiles targeting boys and the high rates that they have in abuse already that was described before, and the fact that we have women who are homosexual pedophiles who are incredibly less likely to exist in the population itself. So that's why we're seeing this variation here in this statistic. Looking at total reported, completed, and attempted rapes, citing the FBI statistics here in 2018, we have 125,000 women reporting that this has occurred to them, where 14,000 men are reporting this as having happened to them. It's worth noting that these are only reported cases that are making it to the FBI's desk. Other groups are estimating that this number of total completed attempted rapes is much higher, in the range of around 700,000 cases. Now, there's a unique caveat here, again, looking at gender differences, that specifically with men, this figure of attempted rape and completed rape is much, much lower when we're not considering the prison population. As soon as we throw in the prison population, that statistic skyrockets. It's hard to tell what the actual rates are, but a lot of researchers are coming out with they feel fairly accurate estimates of 200 million men being raped every year in prison. And that makes sense, that there's a huge rate of sexual offenders, abusers that are in the prison population. Some estimates are about 40% of the prison population would be in that category. And especially within the United States, we have a lot of folks who are not violent offenders being thrown into prison for crimes that is debatable whether or not they belong in prison, but there they are. And simply put, we're throwing a lot of sheep into the wolves' den when it comes to prison practices in the United States. False allegations is a hot topic in terms of research. It's hard to know how many false allegations are false, and quite often people will try and draw from this particular concern in defending people who are accused of sexual abuse. Now, when it comes to adults, there is what to talk about, and as in all of these particular issues, this is a complex topic. So, approaching it in black and white terms, right off the bat, you're probably saying something which ain't true. However, when it comes to children reporting false allegations, the estimates are quite low. We're looking at preschool, kindergarten age kids, around 1%, maybe 2% are going to be false allegations. And in those cases, it's easy to spot, children. Unfortunately, there are some children that do manifest personality disorders, have other issues at play that would explain why they're reporting when they are. But this is such a dramatically small number. Adolescents in general, a little more elevated. We're looking around 10%. Of 8 to 10% of those folks reporting false allegations, and so the average in general we're looking at is hovering around 5% when it comes to all kids involved. 5% may very well be false allegations, and we have to be vigilant. No one wants to throw somebody who's innocent in prison, especially with my prison statistic I mentioned earlier. That is definitely not ideal, especially because pedophiles also within prison populations are targeted for their crimes, and that is a serious concern. But when it comes to children, that concern is quite low. Within the research in general, outside of children, we're seeing a range between 1 to 9% of allegations in general when it comes to adults as being false allegations. And here also we're running into definition issues. There are differences between what's proven as a false allegation as opposed to unfounded allegations. that the police determine after the fact, don't have enough evidence to go to file charges, where no crime is determined at the scene. That's another factor involved. So while this statistic is low, there are, and again, it's hard to tell. There are a fair amount of cases that may very well fit in the category of false allegation, but for definition reasons are not included in that figure. But that's a good rule of thumb. A part of why false allegations happen, some is malicious, and I'm going to be addressing that momentarily, but a lot is not. There are honest mistakes people make. There is a problem within psychology in the way that clients are interviewed and given therapeutic assistance that may actually create false memories, and this is something that is well established in research. Another is confusion that a victim has, because they have been in a very traumatic experience that they might not be able to identify the right, even though they have been abused and assaulted, that they can't identify the right individual who did so. And another factor that can contribute to false allegations is memory conformity. That as witnesses discuss the issue, people's memories are, so to speak, quote unquote, updated or altered by other witnesses' testimony, and so it's hard to arrive at the truth for these honest mistakes. However, there does exist malicious false allegations, and again, the research is very poor in being able to outline this, and the best research in terms of methodology that I could find was an old research that was done in the U.S. Air Force, where they found that, again, around hovering this 14% marker of false allegations did exist, and within that number, there were many malicious reasons why people were reporting false allegations. The most significant was simple revenge. The other was to compensate for feelings of guilt after the fact, even though the participants were both willing at the time. 13% reported false allegations out of fear that they were pregnant and didn't want to upset their family members, their mothers and fathers. 12% was to conceal affairs. 9 was to test their husband's love, that when they reported that they were abused, to see if their husbands would actually stand up and be advocates for them and defend them or not. 9% could be contributed to mental health disorders. 4% to avoid personal responsibility for what they were doing. The next frequent was failure to pay. That these individuals were actually extorting the man that they slept with, and the man was saying, "No doing, I'm not paying you money," and then they went on to fulfill their threat and actually reported their experience as a rape. And the 3% thought that that they might have caught a sexual transmitted disease, and again, this is a unique category of revenge, but more rooted in the actual sexual act itself. What is important to note in the use of outlining all of these possible reasons is that in a case like this that we're dealing with here in Israel with Chaim Walder, that these reasons simply do not in any way show up with the people that are having claims against him. We're talking about children. We're talking about individuals who are across many different walks of life. They are not connected as friends. They're not connected in any other way except one vector. They saw this man in one capacity or another as clients, or within his summer camp, or connected to his family in some way, like babysitters. These are people that are completely disconnected from each other, however, are saying the same thing. When looking at false allegations, one of the easiest ways to demonstrate that these allegations are not false is when you have large numbers of individuals coming forward like this, and you can rule out that they were collaborating with each other. which certainly, like I said, exists in this case that we'll be analyzing in this presentation. Now, zeroing in on demographic characteristics of pedophiles. Who are they? How many are there? And what are they like? Recent estimates put pedophiles at 1% of the population. To put this in perspective, about 2% of the population suffers from schizophrenia. This is an incredibly rare disorder that people are suffering from. Even within that 1%, this figure is including those who've never acted on their sexual urges. When we consider abusers who are interested in pubescent children, that figure jumps to 2%. So again, we're talking about low numbers, and on top of that, a fair amount of these people are not sexual offenders, and that they are struggling with the desires they have quite nobly and admirably. 40%, 44% of pedophiles are older adults, so between the ages of 40 and 70. So this particular sexual deviancy is showing up much later in life. Here, in terms of treatment, this rules out realistically this idea that, well, maybe it'll burn out. A lot of people who defend child abusers, not in the sense of making excuses for them, but trying to see if they can be helped without having to be put in prison, will oftentimes think, well, with good intention, well, what we can do here is, we'll watch this guy for a little while and see if the whole thing burns out. And that just simply is not the case. That we have a large portion of this population who are going to continue to abuse much later in life, and that the rates of pedophilia specifically are much higher than any other types of sexual abuse that you're going to run into. Like I mentioned previously, that the overwhelming number of people who are in this category are men. The estimates are that women abusers are around 6% of all cases. But here we're running into problems if this is a legitimate figure, just because, as we listed previously, not all sexual acts are acted on, number one, and number two, not all sexual acts are going to be actual sexual intercourse. That it may very well be that violations that women are committing are going to be perhaps misconstrued as caregiving activity. Like I mentioned, bouncing on the knee, or combing, stroking the hair. All these things are perfectly beautiful and wonderful, and people should do them. And do not, suspect people of abuse, because, like I said, this is such a small population. We need more evidence to accuse people of such activities, and kids need that sort of physical contact to thrive and grow and be healthy individuals. At the same time, it may very well mask how many women are sexual offenders. And lastly, mothers may themselves, because they are the primary caregivers generally, and the vast majority of these cases, the children are discovered in doctor's visits, that they become gatekeepers, ensuring that their crimes are not discovered. One caveat is, the way that boys would relate to this behavior. Quite often, immaturely, boys may very well relate to this as a rite of passage, and as already described, child victims generally blame themselves for what occurred, or that it's no big deal and they can handle it, and it becomes a trade-off. Do they report their primary caregiver and lose the person they love and is feeding them and clothing them and taking care of them in all these other ways, in order to protect themselves? Now we may very well, say, yes, they should do this, but the victims themselves are struggling with this and quite legitimately are terrified to find where they will end up next. Now, one question we have to ask ourselves is, well, why is it that men are so predominantly making up the population of sexual offenders? And one theory is the male variability hypothesis, where you see across all different factors that men are going to be predominantly, like if you break up a population into a bell curve, the tails in these bell curves, men predominantly make up the vast majority of those members in the tails of any issue, whether it's IQ. The vast majority of men are geniuses and the vast majority of men are going to make up those who are suffering from mental retardation. You're going to see men who are going to be predominantly outnumbering women in terms of their mathematic abilities. However, on the other side of that tail, you're going to see the vast majority of men are the ones who simply cannot put two and two together. There are mating selection reasons for this. Women generally are, like I mentioned previously, are selecting mates who are going to be higher in the hierarchy and selecting for competence. And so that is one explanation why you're going to see such variability in men in almost any issue, whereas women are going to be much more diverse in their interests and their abilities. So, the self-same women who would be able to be at the same level as men in say mathematics are going to have multiple interests: English, astronomy, and so there's a diversity there that simply doesn't exist with men. Pedophilia, the best way to look at pedophilia is that it's its own type of sexual orientation, that the attraction to children begins at puberty, and that 7% of pedophiles do identify themselves as having one exclusive attraction, whereas the rest are extremely flexible and non-exclusive in who they seek as victims. So that does make a lot of sense in the case here with Chaim Walder, who had a diversity of victims that he was a predator against, without having specific characteristics he was looking at and sexually attracted to. As far as getting a more detailed analysis of what offenders like this look like, there's conflicting reports whether or not they have lower intelligence, higher intelligence. And again, the reports that indicate that they have a lower than average IQ, we have to keep in mind we're looking at prison demographics, and that may very well skew what we're looking at here. There is a predominance of left-handedness, and we're going to get into that in the next slide here, in describing what the cognitive and brain deformities that exist, that may be one explanation as to why we have people like this in our population and what's going on with them. But it indicates that there's a disturbed hemispheric brain lateralization, and that, again, that we'll get into that in more detail, but again, that's connected to sexual deviancy. These folks are usually much shorter in terms of height. They have a greater number of older brothers, and that's an interesting factor in terms of also predicting, not just correlating, but predicting sexual orientation for men. That there are genetic factors in the womb that when mothers carry multiple sons, the immune system starts to target male chromosomes, and that this definitely has effects in sexual orientation. And so we're also seeing the same effect with sexual abusers, pedophiles, and much more prevalent with homosexual pedophilia. There's a higher rate of second-digit, fourth-digit ratio in their hands, so that's also interesting, and that indicates a lower prenatal androgen. There's impaired cognitive abilities, neuroendocrine differences, like I said, brain deformities and abnormalities, usually in the frontocortical area of the brain. Mothers are more likely to have received psychiatric care. Quite often, pedophiles will present as normal, even despite the fact that they have personality disorders. And we're seeing low employment in this demographic. Now, the idea of abusers having been abused is a hot topic, and that there is some evidence to support this idea that if an individual has been abused in their history, that they go on to be abusers. There's a compared to random control of the general population, which would be 15% of the population. The people who have been abused, 28% do go on to be abusive themselves, and that's hard to parse, because like I mentioned previously, a lot of people who are the abusers are related to the person who's abused, and it's very difficult to separate genetic factors from the things that have happened in their history. So it may very well be that the act of being abused is not significant, and that this is just happens to be a phenomena of genetics. In this demographic of people who go on to be abusers, 47% are women. And in as far as people who have been abused going on to be abusers, they tend to be the homosexual pedophile type, as opposed to a heterosexual pedophile type. Now, there is some indication that those people who go on to be abusers, their targets are generally the same age that they themselves were abused. But it's important to point out, despite all of this data, that the vast majority of people who are they themselves abused do not go on to be abusers themselves. And so even though that there is some statistical significance here, that is not the general rule. And like I mentioned, it may very well only be genetic factors having nothing to do with being abused themselves. So what are comorbidities in this demographic? We're looking at around 60% of pedophiles having substance abuse problems. 70% have another paraphilia issue, like voyeurism, things of that nature, covert rubbing up against other people, exhibitionism, things like that. Those would be in the category things in the category of paraphilia. They generally feel lonely, inferior, having very low poor self-esteem. There's emotional immaturity in this population. They have difficulty with age-appropriate interactions with other people, low assertiveness, a lot higher rates of passive-aggressive behavior, and higher rates of expressing anger, which again, that would go into the immature emotional processing. That anger oftentimes is a secondary emotion that is being used as an avoidance tactic to avoid primary emotions people are feeling: sadness, fear, feelings of that sort that are more soft in nature. They have difficulty with emotional regulation and display higher rates of psychological defense mechanisms: intellectualization, denial, cognitive distortions, rationalizations, things of that nature. Depending upon the research being done here, we have as high as 80% of this population having another major psychiatric disorder, 60% suffering from anxiety disorders, half the population suffering from an impulse control disorder, things like kleptomania, things like gambling, things like that. Narcissism, psychopathic traits, antisocial personality traits, they're also very prevalent. In this population, they simply, in many cases, lack remorse and think what they're doing is good and fine. And there's a very palpable skew of being able to be in touch with reality and the damage they're doing in these sexual acting out behaviors. Breaking down in terms of what type of personality disorder these folks are having, 70 to 80% have lifetime rates, where we're seeing 43% having cluster C personality disorders, 33% cluster B, and 18% cluster A personality disorders. So a very disturbed population. And again, I know I keep throwing this in here, that it's worth noting. It is difficult to know if a lot of this is just because this is a prison population, or is this reflective of the general pedophilia population? But given the research in brain deformity, there is very good reason to assume that a lot of this would be in the general population and not just because of poor sampling. Now, what are these brain deformities? So what we're seeing here is a lot of abnormalities in the unilateral lobe, the bilateral frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the cerebellar. So what this all implies is that there is severe neurological disruption in psychosocial and psychological processing, impulse control issues, addiction, OCD, antisocial personality disorders, all have these same brain abnormalities. zeroing in on the temporal lobe, temporal lobe epilepsy and Culver-Bucy syndrome. These are disorders that you'll see when there's abnormalities in the bilateral regions of the brain where there's lesions in the temporal lobes. And so the connection there between these particular disorders and abnormalities, you see that there is deficits in erotic discrimination and arousal. There is very little rhyme or reason to what arouses these individuals that suffer from these abnormalities, and that there is either hyposexual or hyposexual behavior. Serotonin is also linked to paraphilia, and again, serotonin does play a role in impulse control and OCD. Head trauma has also been connected to paraphilia, and specifically, head trauma that's so severe that one loses consciousness. And we're seeing, when there's head trauma, when it occurs while in the early stages of brain development before the age of 6. So again, the hesitation of how we assess the population, because it's coming from prison population, but at the same time, all of these examples of brain abnormalities does point to a very significant biological factor in why these offenders are doing what they're doing. So who are the prime targets of pedophiles? Generally, people who are being targeted are low in education. They have parents who are not around in the home. They're working full-time jobs, 2 part-time jobs. They're out of the house 3 shifts, and so latchkey kids is who we're looking at. Their mothers and fathers themselves have a lower education and have a lower economic level. The mothers of these children are going to more likely be single, and these kids are suffering from dad deprivation. So, if we were to look at what pedophiles themselves say about who they're targeting, they themselves are quite strategic. They are looking for the most vulnerable kids they can find from divorced homes, kids who are needy, who are unhappy, and who they would see as simply needing a friend. So even if children are not meeting the profile of what pedophiles are sexually attracted to, again, there's a high level of indiscriminate victims, that basically whoever pedophiles can find, they will go after. But they themselves, in reported interviews, are quite clear that there is a high level of strategic thinking in their abuse. There's a pattern of grooming. 70 to 85% of pedophiles say that all of this is premeditated. What's motivating them, one way of conceptualizing this, is that they have a compulsive, aggressive urge that is planned out with intention. So it's methodical. There is a sense of patience in their crimes, but this patience is paradoxically being motivated by relieving this intense internal pressure that's building up inside of them. So on the one hand, they do have this impulse control dilemma, but the way that it is being resolved is through a high level of patience. They're targeting people who are unsupervised. We're looking at, and they're going to be trying to fill leadership roles where they don't have anyone looking over their shoulder. So we're talking babysitters. They're taking positions in volunteer organizations, coaches, teachers. And in this case that we're going to be analyzing with Chaim Walder, he himself was a therapist. There's no other profession that exists that is as private as a therapist. The way that victims are groomed is through persuasion, friendship, trust. One way of thinking about predators is that they're very patient and kind, and that they're using these two very noble and genuinely, by and large, very good character traits, and using them to their advantage. They rarely use force with their victims, and they're essentially putting their victims on a desensitization track where there is a slow incremental increase of provocative sexual innuendo to actual touch. And so again, that goes a long way in demonstrating just how planned out these criminals are thinking about how to commit their crimes that they're committing. Regarding the characteristics of the abuse itself, there's different types of abuse, as I've already discussed previously, whether it's exposing oneself, undressing a child, physically stimulating oneself, or covertly or not covertly rubbing one's private parts against the child, fondling, and then actual physical penetration. All of these are in the wheelhouse of pedophiles. And there will be unique desires. Not every pedophile does want to have physical penetration with children, and may very well just have a fetish. That does, and vice versa. That the fetish may very well be physical penetration, and build up to that, and that they're putting children on a desensitization plan of increasing sexual contact. So there's a wide variety of what abuse actually looks like. In long-term abuse, the average age of victims is around the age of 8, whereas single cases, generally the average age of children is 11. It's more likely that the abuser, 70% of the time, is going to be someone you know. It's going to be a parent, it's going to be a step-parent, a relative, a local authority figure, a neighbor. It's almost always going to be somebody that you actually know. As far as where the abuse takes place, there are gender differences. Girls generally it's more likely that they're going to be abused in their home or in the home of the offender, whereas boys, oftentimes, they're going to be abused in isolated areas, outside, roadways, at school, in motel rooms. So there's a lot more variation of location when it comes to boys. Classically, pedophiles have 5 different psychological defenses that they are protecting themselves with, not confronting their crimes and the abuse that they're doing. One is denial. What's wrong with just giving a hug? The other is minimization. It only happened once, it's no big deal. Justification is another defense mechanism, that it has some sort of educational value, or that the initiation of these children into the sexual world is important for their development, it's actually good for them. Fabrication, this was just research. And then there's various character attacks against children and also authority figures. The child made me do it, the child wanted it, the child was the one who was harassing me. The authority figures don't understand what I'm doing. So things of that nature. And again, it's hard to tell, while I'm categorizing these as defense mechanisms, it's hard to tell if this has to do with the neurological abnormalities that this population has, and in fact, they're just out of touch with reality. They actually believe this, as opposed to it being a psychological defense. Unfortunately, treatment is often not successful with this population. We have no evidence of this problem being curable. Changing sexual preference, there is no treatment that can help people in this area. What is possible is that we can in treatment try and reduce the sexual acting out that these folks have. So classic treatment is going to usually be CBT or some variation of third wave CBT, incorporating, say, ACT principles or principles in other behavioral approaches. And the targets are going to try and be addressing the cognitive distortions, the denial that this population has. The empathy training is another focus, trying to get abusers to understand the pain that they're causing to the people they're abusing. Basic sexual impulse control training, and trying to strategically plan to avoid relapse. Now, the best outcomes are going to be using combined psychotherapy with psychopharmacological approaches, whether SSRIs, chemical or physical castration, different medications that reduce testosterone. All of these are going to be more effective than just therapy alone. It's worth noting that even when pedophiles are undergoing physical castration, they'll oftentimes try and counter that physical castration using various medications and chemicals to up their testosterone so they can continue to abuse despite the castration. Now, like I said, there are mixed results here. Depending upon the research, CBT has been shown to have no effect or some effect in reducing reoffending. And as far as other treatments are concerned, you're going to see this with pure behavioral approaches. The psychodynamic approach has much lower effectiveness in terms of treatment, and aversion and conversion therapy, it does absolutely nothing in terms of trying to sort out this population. Again, emphasizing that it is, while there is some flexibility in sexual expression, and it may very well be, sometimes people will enter into conversion or aversion therapy. Positive results with those folks may very well only be due to the fact that there is more flexibility in their sexual orientation, but that fundamentally there is no treatment in terms of changing a person's sexual preferences. However, controlling those urges, we do have success in doing that, but like I said, the success is rather meager. Now there's a 50% rate of reoffending. The highest rate of reoffenders are going to be pedophiles who are in the category of homosexual and bisexual pedophiles, and the lowest recidivism is going to exist with incest pedophiles, and a part of that is age. Incest is often happening with younger kids, and you have more falling into sexual experimentation, and there's a lot less maliciousness in that category, but that's not a hard and set rule, and it's not just that children amongst children are committing incest. Now, this data of 50% of recidivism is probably an exaggeration, because within the research, folks who drop out of treatment are not included. It's very difficult to calculate offenses that are slipping under the radar, that are as not severe as the offenses these folks are coming into and being prosecuted and thrown into prison for. And there are time reporting limits. What we've seen with pedophiles is that there is a 10-year window that they will reoffend, and why is it 10 years? Could be because they're in prison and their parole officer is on these folks, and there's a high level of supervision in that 10-year time span. But once people are no longer as much on these folks, they go back to reoffending. So a lot of this research is only watching well, what is the reoffending rates over a 1 to 5 year time span. It's just simply not enough to get a good figure. Now, treatment interfering factors. There's a high deviancy level. I mean, the comorbidity that we were seeing in terms of Axis 1 and Axis 2 disorders is incredibly high. There is a high level of sociopathic and antisocial personality traits with this population, and the diversity in which these offenders are sexually turned on is quite flexible, and so it's very hard to target exactly well, what are the behaviors, what are the cues, what are the triggers of this population, because their sexual interest is so flexible. So with all of this information, I'd like to push forward and try and analyze the case of Chaim Walder. My goal here is to help people better understand what has happened, how to understand why he did what he did, to have a better picture of what to look for in protecting children, and how do we move forward with these devastating revelations. So I'm going to give an overview of who Chaim Walder was. What did he do? How is he famous? Why are people so shocked by this case? I'm going to give a personality assessment as best I can, given the information I have. Now, I have to make clear I can't diagnose this individual. I've never met him. And in some sense, it might be useful to think of this as a theoretical discussion of a case like this. Now, I realize that in saying that, some people might be put off. Well, of course, how obvious do things need to be here? I mean, there is so much evidence of what he did, and I agree. At the same time, trying to maintain on my end some professional responsibility, that it is a serious thing in every case to diagnose an individual, and it's worth noting that I have never met this person, and my analysis is purely speculative. And finally, I'm going to dive into the issues of cultural competency in being a therapist or social worker working in the ultra-Orthodox population. It is important for folks who are doing that sort of work to be aware of Jewish law and how a lot of these different issues are being looked at to better navigate those issues, to create the allies you need to, and to protect the victims that desperately need our protecting. So who was Chaim Walder? He was born in Haifa. Chaim Walder attended yeshivas Kol Torah and Knesset Chizkiyahu. He was married at age 21 and had actually served in the military, which is something quite it's not out of the ordinary in the ultra-Orthodox population. He served as a teacher in that while he was in the army, and afterwards he became a teacher in the elementary school system for the Haredi population, the Cheder system. While serving that capacity as a teacher, he stumbled upon a way in which to captivate the children's attention using child stories that they themselves have reported, using them as educational tools, and to bring out for kids to help develop emotional understanding, emotional IQ. This idea spread like wildfire, and soon over 30,000 people had submitted letters to Chaim Walder of their stories, children's stories that they themselves had written, in which he published in various book form. By 2011, he had published over 26 volumes of both children and later adult books, again focusing on true stories, self-report stories that are trying to highlight emotional intelligence, emotional processing, overall, better living. I mean, these are more than just chicken soup for the soul books, but really trying to, it appeared anyway, serving as examples of how to relate to one's internal life. These books were incredibly popular, and had been ranking as the top 5 best selling books in all of Israel, not just within the religious population, but the entire population at large. It's been estimated that over 2 million books of his have been sold and in print. Capitalizing on his success between 1990 and 2021, he was a columnist for the newspaper Yatid Ne'aman, writing on social issues. He had his own radio talk show on the radio channel Kol Chai, and he was the head of the Center for the Child and Family, this clinic was located in Bnei Brak. He was a certified educational counselor treating trauma and abuse. There has been some within the professional field that have disputed whether or not he was actually a trained therapist. That's a question mark. I can't necessarily identify to what extent that actually is, but it seems to be that on some level he did have some significant training in being a therapist. He had opened a summer camp, and in 2003 he received the Defender of the Child Award from the Israel National Council for Children. Now, in November 2021, Aaron Rabinowitz and his co-author at Haaretz, a newspaper here in Israel, had reported allegations of sexual abuse by Chaim Walder. Over 20 victims had come forward. and there had been a Jewish court proceeding that took place in the city of Tzfat that was headed by Rav Shmuel Eliyahu. Rav Chaim Walder was summoned to this Jewish court. Here in Israel, the legal system is a bit interesting, where there are independent religious courts that exist and a secular court, and they work in tandem in many ways and independently. This system was created by the British when they had occupied Israel, and that system continued through when the state of Israel was created. So the Jewish legal system has a significant force within Israeli society. There are limitations to it. However, that being the case, Chaim Walder was summoned to this Jewish court. He refused to appear, and over 25 years of abuse of pubescent and prepubescent girls, boys, and adult women were revealed in these proceedings. Victims came forward, reporting from different walks of life the type of abuse they had suffered in hotels, at his bookstore, in his clinical room, at his summer camp. There was clear manipulation and desensitization tactics that he was using in his grooming of these individuals. And what's most tragic is that all these individuals were themselves victims, suffering from abuse, coming to him for treatment, and fundamentally him using his position as therapist to further their abuse. Walder was recorded coercing one victim to conceal her evidence and pull out her claim, pull out her testimony that she had been abused by him. And in that recording, we hear Chaim Walder threatening that he would commit suicide if ever these crimes of his were exposed. The Jewish court found him guilty of sexual abuse, and his case then proceeded to secular court here in Israel on December 26th. The newspaper Yediot Aronot had reported claims of 5 additional victims. One was a family friend. Another was the family's babysitter who had watched his children. On December 26th, Walder's family revealed that he was missing. On December 27th, Walder was found dead from self-inflicted gunshot wounds to the head. A suicide note was retrieved, and in his body was found at the grave of his son, who had passed away from cancer in 2019. Days later, one of Chaim Walder's victims herself committed suicide. Her friends claim that the reason why she took her life was because, not in all sectors of ultra-Orthodox society, but that there were some ultra-Orthodox news outlets that had whitewashed Chaim Walder's history, were ignoring these quite substantive allegations, and painting a picture of somebody who was innocent. And who's Chaim Walder? In assessing Chaim Walder's personality, I'm going to be drawing from the research I've already presented on pedophilia and sexual abuse. I'll be drawing from the rough outline of his general history and the reports of the abuse themselves. I'll be using the Big Five, which is the only validated personality assessment tool that has broad and very accurate research qualities to it. You can think of the Big Five as being a fingerprint of a person's personality. There are 5 dimensions that the Big Five uses: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, these 5 can be broken up into subdivisions. So, for example, openness includes an interest in intellectual ideas as well as artistic and emotional novelty. Conscientiousness can be broken up into orderliness and industriousness. Extroversion can be broken up into enthusiasm and assertiveness. Agreeableness can be broken up into compassion and politeness. And neuroticism can be broken up into volatility and withdrawing from threat. Now, looking at Chaim Walder, it seems to be that he had high levels of openness. He had broad artistic and emotional interests. He was well groomed, well kept. He displayed high levels of creativity in terms of what was reported and how he was organizing his in his educational program and the books he was writing. It's clear this man was creative in many different areas, from being on the radio as a radio host, to a columnist, to writing itself, in terms of presentation as a public speaker. He was high in artistic and emotional openness. He was seemed to be extremely high in conscientiousness. This was a person who was juggling multiple businesses and multiple creative projects. Again, looking at his physical appearance, he seemed quite well put together, neat, orderly, clean, well kept. His workspace and all, and I understand this is anecdotal, but his workspace and all the pictures that have ever been shown of his workspace, no clutter, no mess. This is someone who has patience. This person is somebody who's hardworking. This is somebody who would have the personality characteristics to put into place well-laid plans. He seemed to be also extremely high in extroversion. He was willing to put himself out there in uncomfortable positions, in public speaking, and all of the other creative formats that he was involved in. And the ability to describe the emotions that he was and appreciate them and to put them out there in book form shows he had a high emotional IQ. Someone who was very charismatic. He was very low in agreeableness. Now, this is a complicated issue because, again, this is someone who probably was relying on his high levels of orderliness and industriousness to be polite, to be using his charisma to be cunning and to enable him to commit the crimes that he was committing. Given the acts that he had done, it's clear this man had no compassion, and that when looking at the way that he threatened suicide and the suicide letter and the actions that he had committed against all of his victims, it's clear that this person had sociopathic and narcissistic traits, that he was wanting, especially at the end of his life, that he wanted to preserve his good name in his work. In his suicide letter, he mentioned nothing about his family. He mentioned nothing about the victims or the pain they had gone through, showing extremely low empathy for those around him, and being fixated on revenge, that he saw himself as killing himself so he could walk in front of God himself and lay his claims against all of these people who were, he saw, abusing him. Clear narcissistic personality traits. It also seems he had low neurotic traits. Again, neuroticism is, you can think of as being threat sensitive, so he was very low in threat sensitivity. Most people who suffer from pedophilia do not act out their desires. One major reason is because they're afraid to do so. They're afraid of being caught. They're afraid of the repercussions of their actions, and this was clearly lacking with Chaim Walder. He was cold. He was calculating. This man was intelligent. This man knew what he was doing, how he wanted to do it, when and where. Again, hearkening back to this idea of a lack of impulse control, this sexual desire that must be acted out, but doing so with high levels of orderliness and cunning. Now suicide behavior is complicated. And it's worth touching a little bit on this, especially because some people in Israeli society see that his suicide was an example of him being a victim. Now, again, I never met Chaim Walder. I can't say precisely with exactness that what I'm about to argue is true. However, given my clinical experience in the literature, this does seem to track. That his suicidal behavior was indeed a way of attacking and harming his victims and the Israeli population at large. That this was indeed a vindictive, punitive, narcissistic final act against the world. So suicide is complex. There are gender differences in suicide where women do indeed make more suicide attempts, whereas men actually complete suicide. Male suicide, in one sense, might be looked at as a belief that no one in the world is out there who's willing to help them, and that there's a significant level of despair and nihilism that exists with men, as opposed to women, that it might be true that their suicide attempts are a cry for help. And I say this tentatively because every case of suicide is indeed different, and a clinician needs to tread carefully in these waters. There's two broad types of suicidal action. One is motivated by emotional under control. These are cases, for example, people suffering from borderline personality disorder and severe impulse control issues. These folks will suffer from cognitive shutdown, and their emotions take over, and they're acting on purely in the moment. They are not future oriented, and that this intense pain and suffering they're feeling is palpable, it's real, it's in the now, and all this pain triggers all the pain that exists in their history, resulting in this intense desire just to end it all, to end the pain, not necessarily to kill themselves, but as an avoidance tactic to just stop hurting. So that's the first category of suicide. The second category of suicide is emotional over-control. These are, emotional over-control. Examples of this are people with eating disorders, chronic depression. These folks have high levels of rigidity, high levels of orderliness and industriousness. These suicides are premeditated and often morally motivated as punitive, as a way of punishing those who have hurt the person committing suicide. There is despair in this category. Again, chronic depression, giving up on one's life, giving up on the world. But this is not the I want to escape from pain, but there is a clarity in this suicide that these individuals specifically, they want to end their lives. And it seems to me that it's this type of suicide that Chaim Walder was demonstrating, that this was punitive, this was a way to get back at all the people who had harmed him, and nothing short of narcissistic. What was the ultra-Orthodox response to the Chaim Walder case? By and large, the Haredi population sided with the victims. Large retailers stopped selling his books. His publishers dropped him. His newspaper, Yeted Naaman, suspended his column. His radio program was canceled, and many Haredi news outlets condemned his actions both explicitly and implicitly. Numerous high-profile rabbinic figures denounced Walder and what he had done. That they reiterated that within Jewish law, within the Jewish court system, he was found guilty, and that they advocated for the victims in their care and their protection moving forward. These rabbinic figures condemned Chaim Walder's supporters, that this individual was quote unquote an unrepentant sinner, which would seem to track given the possible narcissism and sociopathic traits that he exhibited. Many different rabbinic figures saw his suicide as I described, one last act of vengeance against the world and against his victims and against authorities. Many rabbinic figures voiced their concerns and their opposition against those who were supporting Chaim Walder, calling them victim blamers. Many highlighted that within Jewish law there's an idea of gossip that is taken very seriously, and that many of Chaim Walder's supporters were hiding behind this false understanding of what does it mean to spread gossip in a way that's against Jewish law. Reiterating that we must protect the victims and that the community at large has an obligation to remove abusers from positions of power and to address this issue that in many ways has been long overdue within the ultra-Orthodox community. Now, to be fair, Since the 1990s, 2000s, this issue has been gaining much more support within the Haredi population, the ultra-Orthodox population. As I mentioned earlier, there are pluses and minuses to having an isolationist community, and this is definitely a minus. It may very well be the case that so many rabbinic figures simply don't understand the horrible repercussions and trauma and life-altering effects of being sexually abused. Again, noting it wasn't until the 1980s that academics had they themselves known as common knowledge how detrimental and life-altering being a sexual victim actually is. Now, this is not an excuse, and certainly people do need to update their ideas of this issue. They have to be in touch with reality. Full stop, period on that one. But we have to appreciate the problem in moving forward and trying to create solutions to further develop a better understanding within this population. So it would be on the shoulders of experts that are they themselves members of this community to get the information out there, to enable and make easier and create easier access to information like this video that I'm producing here to rabbinic figures, community figures, so they know what's in front of them. By and large, this community is filled with well-intentioned people, but a well-intentioned person with bad information is going to make bad decisions. And so it's on us to try and fix that. Now, it's important to understand, again, why is it that so many people were supporting Chaim Walder? The various claims that these supporters had were that he was wrongly shamed, that shaming him and making public the accusations is a form of gossip, and then in Jewish thought, gossip is often compared to an act of murder. That by gossiping against another individual, one is deprived of their livelihood, and it may very well trigger suicide. Another claim was that he was a great person who did many good things, and that should be paid attention to and put in the equation, even if he is guilty of the crimes that were alleged. Some said this was just a ploy of victims, that he wrongly lost his job and livelihood over these accusations, and that many even argued that the way that the Jewish court handled this situation was technically out of line, and that those who were abused have to physically face their abuser. Now, many rabbis disagree with this, and that's not necessarily true. And the last criticism was that these reporters were greedy, that our own Rabinowitz and others were simply trying to ruin the image of the ultra-Orthodox community, and they were motivated by their prejudices and money. This is not to mention that some newspapers did give glowing reports in his obituary, entirely ignoring these issues. Now, I think it's fair to say that, when people eulogize someone's death, that they're more describing themselves and their own personal beliefs than the person they're eulogizing. And that a lot of these claims are not necessarily about Chaim Walder per se, but are fitting into old tropes that may or may not be true, have nothing to do with this case, but cause people to want to defend their community, to defend these perceived heroes that exist in their community. And the bottom line is that we as human beings do have cognitive distortions. We all use self-defense mechanisms to protect how we understand the world is and how we understand reality. And this is traumatic news. And that some people may very well be using maladaptive coping mechanisms to deny that these allegations were true in order to deal with them in the best way they know how. Now, again, this is no excuse, and people do need to challenge their coping mechanisms, but it's a reality we do have to contend with. when earth-shattering news like this does hit the public sphere, scapegoating is quite common. People are trying to find ways to pin this on other people, without sacrificing the image they have of their hero. In this case, Chaim Walder. I mean, this man received medals from the state of Israel. I mean, this man was a beloved child author. He, from what people knew up until now, thought that he was helping countless children and adults in his private practice. And it is much more convenient and easy. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It is much easier simply to ignore information and maintain one's map of meaning, their understanding of the world up to this point. It is dangerous and it is terrifying to do a 180 in issues like this. Because fundamentally, people have to start asking themselves, well, who you thought this guy was is not who he was. How do you make sense of that? And who you thought you were, how could you be duped into believing that this man was anything but evil? It brings into question everything that the offender did. Why did he do what he did? Those children's stories. I mean, was there any motivation for helping children in doing that? Or was that his own pet project to psychologically analyze children to better abuse them, using this information against them so he could be a better abuser? It's very easy to start blaming oneself. Were we all complacently blind, letting this man abuse? How much culpability do we have as individuals, as a community? And facing that shame, facing that guilt, quite often can motivate people to try and deny all the facts that are presented to maintain the way that they were looking at the situation beforehand. In addressing this issue, we have to try and sort out, well, what are the Jewish legal implications of sexual abuse, pedophilia, protecting victims, as well as the idea of how does the Jewish legal system relate to the secular legal system. There's a lot of questions that, in order to approach this responsibly, need to be resolved. A lot of this would fit under the rubric of cultural competence in dealing with the ultra-Orthodox community. Now, Judaism is a loose association of different rabbinical figures. There's no single rabbinic court. There's no centralized legal structure in place. In many ways, Judaism is unfortunately a free-for-all, with different rabbis having different views, oftentimes in dramatically different, taking up dramatically different positions, being in stark opposition to one another. There is no consensus in Judaism. Quite often, within the yeshiva system, there is a certain, I wouldn't necessarily call it despair, but and not cynicism exactly, but a sort of feeling of, well, there's an opinion for everything. And while life is complex, and Judaism does reflect that complexity by having multiple opinions, multiple perspectives, all that is true. Practically speaking, that can get in the way of trying to have some sort of unified way of approaching any issue, and we definitely have that here. So in my analysis of Jewish law, I am going to restrict myself to a couple key figures within the Jewish legal system. One that I'll be predominantly drawing from is Rav Moshe Sternbach. He is the head of the Eda Haredis. Is considered to be one of the premier legal decisors within Judaism that has a wide acceptance across multiple pockets of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. I'll also be drawing from figures that, historical figures that are no longer alive, such as Rav Eliashiv, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. These figures also have a wide acceptance, considered, what's called the Gedolim, the great ones within the Jewish legal system, and their consent they do have a consensus in how to approach these sorts of issues. And admittedly, they do, as I said before, because there's such a wide variety of opinions, there are those that disagree. But it seems to me, looking at the rabbinic literature, that their positions do reflect the majority opinion within halacha, and knowing this, being able to use this strategically, to be able to use this to understand the community better, will go a long way in helping clinicians and social workers be able to better relate to this community. There is a significant emphasis within Jewish law on common sense. Sefer Chassidim, quoting the Sefer Chassidim, he writes that if something is self-evident, that it should be done, even though it's not specifically commanded, there's a punishment for not doing it. A person should have thought that perhaps something that is obvious might be against the will of God, or obligate somebody as being from the will of God. That there is a common sense clause in Jewish law. A similar idea is espoused by Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon in his introduction to the main legal text within Judaism, the Talmud, that he writes that reason that there is punishment for activities not specifically commanded is because all of the commandments that are derived from common sense are obligated on everyone from the day that God first created Adam. This obligation is not only for the individual, but all the individual meaning Adam Rishon, Adam, but all of his descendants afterwards for all generations. Again, that there's this common sense clause within Judaism. Now common sense is a hard thing to define, and depends on context, depends on available information. We're only as good as our insights. We're only as good as our intuitions. Yet it is important to highlight that there is this flexibility within the Jewish legal system, because quite often, in analyzing something as complicated, complex, and emotionally provocative and dangerous as abuse and sexual abuse, you will have figures who will clamp down rigidly and only want to consider the letter of the law as they see it. Now that's complicated enough in Judaism, but it's worth noting that that's not the whole story, and that there has to be this certain level of flexibility of common sense in being able to deal with these sorts of issues. Now, Rav Sternbach, quite provocatively, outlines who is not a rabbi when it comes to sexual abuse. He makes the point that all of our communities have a serious problem, whether it's ultra-Orthodox or whether it's on the other end of the religious spectrum, which is more Masorti, more religious light, however you want to define these terms. Everybody has issues here. And that silencing victims to protect the community is a horrid idea. That it is a mistake to think that there is little harm done to victims, that the harm is dramatic, pervasive, and long-lasting. And it's a mistake to think that abusers can simply do tshuva. And we've outlined all of this information, previously in this presentation. Further, Rav Sternbach asserts that thinking these things, making these mistakes, have led to further dangers for the Jewish people and the religious development of Jews, whether it be the concept of Ava, the idea that it is prohibited for the Jewish individual and Jewish community to be perceived as disgusting and to be hated, that their actions should cause them to be hated by the Jewish and non-Jewish world, as well as this idea of Chil Hashem, of disgracing God. These things, on top of protecting victims, are additional prohibitions within the Jewish legal code. Rav Sternbach avidly asserts that innocent people cannot be sacrificed to save others. Individuals cannot be sacrificed to save face of the greater Jewish community. Now, in Judaism's history of sexual abuse, it has been a common refrain by prominent rabbinic figures that the community is primary, and saving face of the community takes precedence over the individual. And as I mentioned before, it seems to be, again, not making excuses, but it seems to be that a part of this was just an unsophisticated and ill understanding of the outcomes of sexual abuse. That there was not this appreciation of just how damaging that has been for the victims. And that's probably what motivates this perspective, and probably motivates this perspective to individuals who espouse this idea to this day. Covering up abuse is desecrating God's name. It is a disgrace to the Jewish people. It's a disgraceful thing to do, casting all of religious life in a bad light, and should be something that just is simply not tolerated. No victim should be silenced. And the interesting perspective that Rav Sternbach takes here is that a rabbi who disregards all of the above should not be listened to. He's quite clear on this position. And he says that any rabbi who would take this position is not speaking as a rabbinic authority. That rabbinic authority has to contain common sense. It has to have a mastery of the entire Jewish legal system. And the Jewish legal outcomes have to be rooted in reality. They have to be rooted in the facts. And it is quite obvious from everything that we've covered today that protecting abusers and denying victims the protection and the help they need is against common sense. It is against all the different principles within Jewish legal thought that we'll be outlining here, and is certainly against the reality of the situation of just how detrimental this abuse actually is to the individual. He asserts that another rabbi should be sought out who understands these issues well, so that he can give a proper Jewish legal decision, and that is not negotiable. And that this rabbi will undoubtedly back, and must back, reporting all crimes of abuse. This position is also held by Rav Silman, who again is a contemporary rabbi. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach also agrees to this, and Rav Elyashiv would also give the same halachic decision. Now, the next issue that Rav Sternbach outlines is this question of gossip, in Hebrew called lashon hara. Now, lashon hara is prohibited, except under very specific circumstances, and one is the idea of called toelis, that it has to have some constructive purpose to it. Now, he asserts that rumors about abuse have to be investigated, and that these laws of gossip, these laws of lashon hara, do not prohibit investigation, and they do not prohibit informing relevant people in the community in order to avoid future potential harm. Now, as we've seen, sexual predators have spread a wide net in the community, that they generally are trying to find positions of power. They're trying to find positions that do not have oversight. We're talking about authority figures, teachers, in volunteer work. These are positions that enable predators to hunt, and they are hunting. As we've outlined, they know exactly what they're doing. They know who exactly is vulnerable. And these children who are vulnerable are coming from homes where, for whatever reason, parents are unable to protect their children appropriately, and that the greater community has to take responsibility for these members of its community. And a fair argument is made that by making these issues public, we're enabling the community to fulfill its obligation to protect these victims, and makes it that much harder for these abusers to abuse their positions of power that they're operating from. The Piskei Tshuva, major halachic work within the Jewish legal system, makes the following case. That this author writes, I want to note here that while all the books of ethical conduct in Judaism are greatly concerned about the prohibition of gossip, of lashon hara, I am greatly concerned about the opposite problem. I want to protest about the even greater and more common sin of refraining from speaking negatively when it is necessary to save someone from being harmed. By not saying anything, one commits an unbearable sin of transgressing the prohibition that stands next to the prohibition of gossip found in Vayikra, in Leviticus. Do not speak lashon hara, but do not stand idly by when the blood of your fellow man is threatened. This is an obligation that the community, like I said, does need to take upon itself. Because if we don't, no one else will. Now, Rav Sternbach outlines within the Jewish legal system there are emergency measures that can and ought to be taken. Many in this issue in the past have said, well, the witnesses that have seen or heard of the abuse do not meet the standards within the Jewish legal system. The Jewish legal system has, when compared to the secular legal system, has much higher standards of evidence and a completely different philosophy of justice that in many ways makes it much more difficult to prosecute wrongdoers. And so the question is, well, what do we do? Do we allow abusers to escape on a technicality? Or are there ways within the Jewish legal system that we can use to remedy this problem? So the Shulchan Aruch, one of the main organizers of Jewish law and outliners of Jewish law, asserts that a community has the right to peace and tranquility, and to do whatever it needs to preserve this peace and to ensure the security of its members, to punish criminals, to accept in any way it sees fit, to accept any type of evidence that it deems necessary for the community's well-being, and that this position is vital because there are loopholes in any legal system, and Judaism recognizes that and uses this sort of emergency clause as a way of protecting the community. Circumstantial evidence is sufficient in the Jewish legal system and is enough for any individual to report these crimes to other authorities. Rav Sternbach, in outlining the question of mandatory reporting, makes it quite clear we have mandatory reporting. And within Judaism, there's an idea of something called Masira, where during the times of the Roman occupation, during ancient times when Jewish law was being codified in the Talmud, there were no democracies. These were warlords and dictators that were doing as they pleased. There was not law and order that existed in the world, and Judaism took on as a value never to sacrifice its members to these bloodthirsty, barbaric dictators, and that all issues of law must be adjudicated within the Jewish legal system for that reason. And that giving over Jews into these unfair, these unjust legal systems is called Masira, handing over would be the translation there. So Rav Sternbach asserts that Masira does not apply in the case of sexual abuse. And as we're going to see in other areas of law and order, Masira does not apply in modern times. So it certainly doesn't apply to sexual abuse, because sexual abusers have the legal category called rodef. Now, a rodef is an individual, whether they have intentions or don't have intentions in their actions, but their actions will lead to the death of another individual, and that this individual and the community has an obligation to stop a rodef from causing the death of another human being. Now, death is an abstraction here. Even though that sexual abuse does not lead to say suicide of victims, it destroys people's lives. And Judaism has a very liberal conception of what death is, essentially being a likely ruining of the vibrancy and the ability to pursue a noble life in a healthy, stable, in a stable way. So a mental illness, emotional distress that is severe, would be categorized under this idea, this rubric of death. And any individual that would be causing this sort of suffering and dramatic pain must be stopped. Now, there are a lot of technicalities in how to stop such an individual, but for our purposes, certainly reporting this to the authorities is a universal action that can be taken without hesitation. There's a long history within Judaism of turning to local authorities for protection. We see this outlined in halachic authorities such as the Rambam, the Ramah, the Shach, and others. And this is not just in relation to saving life and preserving emotional stability amongst the community. The Chasim Sofer and the Minchas Yitzchak, the Tzitz Eliezer, the Aruch HaShulchan also outline that we can turn to local authorities even to protect property. So certainly abuse, physical abuse, violence, and the destruction of property is completely permitted to turn to local authorities. And the Aruch HaShulchan, supported by the Tzitz Eliezer, offer the argument that, again, as I mentioned, we're not living in ancient times. We live in democracies, we live in governments that have law and order, that do pursue justice, and while it's not exactly true that the philosophy of justice completely overlaps with that of Judaism, it overlaps enough that there is no concept of Masira in modern times. Now, Rav Sternbach further outlines in a case where a government does have mandatory reporting, one must comply with this obligation, and that this obligation of mandatory reporting becomes an additional obligation outside of protecting life, outside of protecting one from emotional harm, outside of these issues of disgracing God and causing hate in the world. There is an additional obligation to report simply because a just government demands its citizens to do so. Now, within the state of Israel, there is a mandatory reporting that exists not just for professionals, but for every individual at every level of Israeli society. If you are a friend, a neighbor, a concerned citizen, it doesn't matter who you are, you have an obligation to report any physical or sexual abuse to social services, definitely. And while there's some technical reasons why maybe it wouldn't be the best idea to report this to the police initially, the police are also another possibility to report these crimes. And one certainly is not transgressing Jewish law by doing so. Because again, as outlined, we do live in a just society where law and order is valued. But as a professional note, the social services, the Revacha here in Israel, are well trained in investigating allegations of sexual abuse. What happens is that a committee is formed when a report is made, and one can report anonymously. That is completely fine. No one has to worry about damaging their reputation in the community because they reported somebody. And so a committee is formed by professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, in order to properly investigate these claims, and specially trained social workers who know what they're doing. They're experts in how to do this. This is as good as it gets, and nothing's perfect, but this is as good as it gets. They investigate the accusations and then make a recommendation of how to proceed. The vast majority of cases that are reported do not move to the criminal justice system, and the Revacha does value trying to resolve these issues in a more holistic way. But certainly they do have the power of law behind them, and in situations that are dangerous and dire, they will and are equipped to save victims. Now, mandatory reporting is not only for children, but any individual who is vulnerable in society, so the elderly as well, not just sexual, physical violence. Any time that an individual cannot protect himself, one is obligated to report such abuse. Now, consulting a rabbi, given the fact that there's mandatory reporting, why is it necessary to seek rabbinic advice? So Rav Sternbach outlines two reasons. Number one, we should always consult a rabbi just for the sake of order, that in a chaotic situation like abuse, emotions are flying, and being able to have the emotional and physical support to make the necessary steps to report are essential, and there's no one better than your local Orthodox rabbi that you trust. So that's number one. Keeping things orderly so that all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. Number two is that it's the obligation of the rabbi to protect the individual who's reporting. Like I said, there is a lot of variation in Jewish law, and there are some individuals who do not agree with the Jewish law that I'm outlining in my presentation here, and they would say, listen, it's prohibited to ever go to a secular government, and these people generally are not the most pleasant to deal with and do pose a threat to life and normal living of people who are trying to stop abuse. And so having rabbinic backing behind you in order to push back against these forces, well, that's essential. And it's just practical to cover your back in this way. Unfortunately, we live in a world where we have to do that. Now, again, reiterating, Rav Sternbach asserts that if a rabbi says not to report for any reason whatsoever, even if this rabbi says, oh, I agree with you, this is a problem, and I can solve the problem, he should not be listened to. He is not acting under Jewish legal authority in any way, shape, or form, and the abuse must be reported. Another competent rabbi needs to be sought for the reasons outlined. And that is that. Simple and straightforward. Now, one caveat, even though it's important to seek rabbinic guidance here for these practical reasons of covering your back and making sure everything is done properly, the reality is sometimes waiting causes more damage. If for any reason that the time it takes to report these problems to a rabbi, that you're running the risk of more damage being done, more victims being made into victims, you skip this step. You go straight to the authorities, you do the reporting, and then seek rabbinic guidance afterwards. Now, like I said, seems like a straightforward position to take. Why is there confusion on this issue? What is motivating the other side to say, no, don't report? What's motivating the other side that motivates them to protect abusers? Well, one is the idea of, well, what are we doing when we stop a rodef? Now, the common halachic position, the common Jewish legal system, is we stop the rodef, we stop the pursuer, because we want to save the victim. That is one position in Jewish law. The other is that, well, no, we're stopping the abuser to save him from sin. So we have a bit of a value clash here. Do we put the individual abuser and his religious development first, or are we putting the victim's well-being first? Now, that is a dispute. Now, no one is saying that either side disregards the other's belief. Everybody wants to protect victims. Everybody wants to encourage people to grow spiritually. The dispute is in the hierarchy of values, which is the most important value? And this would be an example of a value clash, which has precedence. So some do actually put the abuser's religious development ahead of the damage they're doing. Another dispute is, does the Jewish legal system actually have mechanisms in place to suspend how the normal operation of the Jewish system. So one position, the Meiri, an early legal authority, would argue that there is a greater good in maintaining the letter of the law within the legal system, and that there is no flexibility in changing this legal system, that this system is complicated and has different interests constantly at play, and it is a certain level of hubris for anyone to suspend the normal operating procedures and limitations of the Jewish legal system. Whereas the other legal opinion of the Rashba would assert that all systems have limits and nothing is perfect, and there are crises that do arise in normal life, and given that holding on to rigid standards will result sometimes in dramatic damage, there has to be mechanisms in place. It is common sense to believe that the Jewish legal system would make concessions in order to avoid those catastrophes. A final position would be, how rigidly do different legal authorities hold on to the idea of lashon hara? Some, there is very little room to allow gossip, and others do take a more liberal stance, and there is variation across rabbinic authorities in this as well. Sexual abuse is horrific, and it doesn't help that it's a complicated issue. Fortunately, the vast majority of human beings are not abusers. The vast majority of individuals are good people, doing the right thing, fulfilling their obligations as teachers, as therapists, as caregivers. And it's hard to lose sight of that because of how horrific sexual abuse is and the repercussions it has to its victims. And especially in a case like Chaim Walder, where all of our confidence has been betrayed. All of us, on some level, are victims of being lied to, and perhaps some of us have enabled this man to do what he did, unwittingly. A lot of soul searching has to be done in a case like this. How is it that such an individual came to the position that he did, unchallenged and undiscovered for so long? I find it hard to believe no one knew what was going on. And taking a serious look at our obligation of mandatory reporting is the first step that we can take in avoiding problems like this in the future. The second is that those who are being abused are the most vulnerable in our community. Now, everybody has to talk to their kids about safety. But the sad truth is most children are not targets. Kids that are targets are going to be those that don't have the parents around, by and large, to teach them about safety. The closest people to us are generally those that are the abusers. And that parents, teachers, and authority figures in the community do have to be vigilant and cannot say to themselves, nothing bad will ever happen. Even though statistically that is true, we have to hold these two different paradoxes in our hands. That the vast majority of human beings are trustworthy, the vast majority of human beings are trying to do the right thing and become better people. And there are not so many monsters in this world, but man, those monsters that are can do a heck of a lot of damage. And there does need to be vigilance, especially looking at the numbers of how many victims your average pedophile actually has. As mentioned before, for homosexual pedophiles and bisexual pedophiles, 150 victims. 150 victims. Those numbers are not acceptable. No abuse is acceptable. So a serious discussion has to be had. And unfortunately, that discussion is made more difficult by the cognitive distortions we as a community have. Not wanting to face that this sort of thing could happen. Looking at such an individual and being unwilling to entertain the idea. How could someone like this perpetuate such abuse for so long, commit so many horrendous crimes? That is a question people are struggling with. And I hope that the message that I was able to convey in this presentation is no, that it's possible, and it in fact makes quite a lot of sense. This individual's personality profile gave him all the skills necessary to be charismatic and manipulative, and all the different personality aspects of lack of compassion and lack of consideration, of fear, made him the perfect tool in harming others. How do we relate to these people? Are they monsters or are they sick? I'm sure that there's arguments to be made for both. The more that science develops in having a greater understanding of the neurological brain abnormalities that exist, does suggest that a certain aspect here is a mental health illness in of itself. And that it is very hard to have compassion for these people. And practically speaking, whatever compassion we will have for criminals such as this has to be stopped by our dedication to stopping harm. Now, whether in the future therapies or surgeries can heal these people, question mark. And it's an interesting academic discussion we can have. But that is only an academic discussion. What is most practical is doing what we can to protect victims, to take their claims seriously, given the fact that victims rarely make up their claims, and there is a pattern to be able to figure out, well, when is there false reporting. That this is not a complicated question. There are tells we have to take seriously. But especially with children, it is so unlikely that we have to raise awareness of these issues. We have to call a spade a spade. We have to be willing to look evil straight in the eye and trust what these abusers are telling us, that they use patience and kindness to hurt defenseless people. And the challenge for us is not to second guess people's kindness and patience, but not to be suckered into it either. Parents, monitor your children. Neighbors, when parents can't do that, solutions have to be found to try and help kids be well taken care of. To support parents, to support single mothers, to support single fathers, in order so that they can actually be there for their kids more effectively. And not hesitating to use the full power of the law to protect those most vulnerable. A lot of people say it doesn't make sense that Chaim Walder did what he did. From where I sit, I could not have predicted this. But looking back at his behaviors, it makes sense.